The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October of 1833, and Eleanor did not see it until it was too late. She had been in the kitchen garden at the time, cutting the last of the autumn rosemary before the frost took it, her basket already holding a sheaf of dried lavender and a handful of sage that Mrs. Beale had requested for the linen press. The morning was cold and clear, the kind that turned the Ashford grounds silver at the edges, and Eleanor had been content in it, as she often was when the house's demands had not yet found her. She wore her grey wool shawl over her oldest dress, and her boots left marks in the soft earth between the herb beds, and she had been thinking about nothing in particular except the way the light moved across the stone wall at the garden's far end, slow and golden, and indifferent to everything that was about to change. It was Mrs. Beale who met her at the kitchen door. The housekeeper's face, which had presided over Ashford Cottage for 22 years with the unshakable composure of someone who had weathered all the Voss family's seasons, held an expression Eleanor had not seen on it before. Not alarm exactly, something quieter and worse than alarm, the look of a person who has already understood something and is waiting for the person in front of her to understand it too. "Your father is in the study," Mrs. Beale said. "He has been there since before 6. Eleanor set the basket on the kitchen table and unwound her shawl. Her father was often in the study before the household was properly awake, and this alone would not have signified anything. But Mrs. Beale did not move away from the door, and her hands, which were never idle, were folded at her waist in the posture of someone keeping themselves very still on purpose. "Was a letter delivered?" Eleanor asked. "Several," Mrs. Beale said, "one sealed with a solicitor's mark." Eleanor went down the corridor toward the study. She had lived in Ashford Cottage for all of her 26 years, and she knew the house the way one knows a long, familiar body, the cold stone flags of the lower hall in November, the particular creak of the second stair, the smell of the library just before rain. Ashford was not grand. It was a modest property in the north of Hertfordshire, its front rooms low-ceilinged and its gardens more productive than ornamental. But it had been her mother's before her marriage, and her grandmother's before that. And whatever else the Voss household had been, Ashford had always been certain. Eleanor had not, until this morning, had occasion to question that certainty. She paused at the study door. Through the oak, she could hear her father's voice and, beneath it, the careful murmur of someone choosing his words for him, which meant the solicitor Mr. Crabbe had come in person. She did not knock. She turned back toward the kitchen because she had learned, over 26 years in this house, that certain conversations were held in rooms she was not invited into, and that forcing her way into them rarely changed the outcome, only announced her awareness of it. She spent the rest of the morning in the library instead, which was the room she had always trusted most. The library at Ashford held perhaps 400 volumes, some of them her grandmother's, some acquired over the years by her father in the occasional flush of good feeling he experienced after a season of cards went well. Eleanor had read nearly all of them. She sat by the window with a volume of natural history she had read 3 times before, and did not absorb a single word of it, and listened to the sound of the house around her. Her mother found her there at 11:30. Margaret Voss was a woman who moved through rooms as though she had been told she was being observed and had chosen to believe it. She was not without intelligence. She simply applied her intelligence exclusively to questions of advantage, which made her appear, in most rooms, considerably more confident than she was. She entered the library with her best morning cap on and her posture arranged for an audience, even though the only audience was Eleanor and the empty chairs. "Your father has been in correspondence," she said, settling herself across the room near the fireplace, with the air of someone conferring a great favour. "I gathered as much," Eleanor said. There has been an inquiry about the property. Margaret smoothed the front of her gown. A buyer. A serious one, your father says. The offer was received some weeks ago and your father has been negotiating terms. He tells me it is settled. Eleanor set down the natural history and looked at her mother directly. Settled. The sale of Ashford Cottage, Margaret said without inflection, without apology, without any apparent awareness that she was describing the end of the world as Eleanor had known it. The matter is concluded. Mr. Crabbe came this morning with the final papers. Eleanor did not speak. She had the particular Voss discipline of silence, though hers was made of different material than her mother's. Margaret's silence was strategic. Eleanor's was the kind that forms when there is nothing that can be said that would be adequate to what is being heard. The buyer will send someone to inspect the property, Margaret continued. A representative, or the buyer himself, your father is not certain which. They will arrive within the fortnight. We are to extend every courtesy. She paused, and then, as though this were a natural addition, Mr. Hartwell has expressed his interest again, if you wish to know. His letter arrived the same post. Your father considers it a very eligible solution given our current circumstances. Eleanor stood. She crossed to the window and looked out at the kitchen garden, where her basket was still sitting on the table inside, and the rosemary she had cut that morning was the last she would cut from that soil as its owner. I see, she said. It was all she said, and Margaret, who had been waiting for protest, received its absence with something that might have been relief or might have been disappointment, and left the room. 3 days passed in a kind of suspended understanding. Gerald Voss did not come out of his study before noon. Margaret made calls in the village and returned with the particular energy of a woman circulating information she had already decided to present as another person's fault. Eleanor worked the household accounts, answered the correspondence that would have otherwise gone unanswered, and sat with Mrs. Beale in the evenings after the family had retired, not discussing what was happening exactly, but present together in the kitchen while the fire burned down, which was a form of discussion they had practiced for years. It was Mrs. Beale who first told her what the purchase price had been. She had heard it from Mr. Crabbe's clerk, who was known to talk when his employer was not watching. £800, Mrs. Beale said, without looking up from the mending in her lap. The exact sum of what your father owes. Eleanor held her teacup for a moment without drinking from it. £800 was a precise and deliberate number. It cleared Gerald's debt without remainder and left him with nothing additional, which meant there had been no surplus to negotiate from, no cushion, no question of charity dressed as commerce. Ashford had been worth considerably more than £800 when her mother inherited it. The estate of her grandmother's time, with its 4 acres of kitchen garden and the small orchard and the old stable, had been appraised at closer to £1,200 in better years. But Gerald's management of the last decade had run the property and its owner's accounts in the same direction, and £800 apparently was what remained. Who is the buyer? Eleanor asked. A Mr. Lewis, Mrs. Beale said. That is all Mr. Crabbe's clerk knew. No family mentioned, no county given. A London solicitor acted as agent. Eleanor nodded and set down her cup. She thought about Mr. Lewis that evening, and the evenings that followed, in the way one thinks about an abstraction that has not yet become a face. He was the person who had signed a paper that displaced her. She held no particular feeling toward him for it. Her father had sold the house, not Mr. Lewis. But she was curious about the kind of person who purchased a modest Hertfordshire property through an agent without visiting it, for the exact sum required to discharge a gambling debt, with no apparent interest in anything beyond the transaction. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October, and he was not what she had expected. Eleanor was on the gravel path between the stable and the kitchen garden when the hired chaise drew up at Ashford's front gate. She watched the driver hand down a single trunk and a leather valise. The man who descended from the carriage wore a dark wool coat, well cut but without ornament, and he looked first not at the house but at the grounds around it, the old orchard to the east, the kitchen garden's stone wall, the line of beech trees that bordered the property on the north side. He stood there for a moment in the October light, with his hat in one hand, and took in the property the way a person reads a room they have heard described but never entered. There was nothing hasty in it. He was perhaps 30 years of age, perhaps a little more, with the kind of steady bearing that one usually associates with men who have spent a great deal of time outdoors and are comfortable in their own stillness. His coat had no mud on it yet, though this would change. He carried himself without the self-conscious rectitude of a man aware he is being watched, which distinguished him immediately from the majority of visitors Ashford had received in Eleanor's memory. Mrs. Beale had come out to the front step by the time Eleanor reached the garden gate, and the usual introductions were performed. The visitor was Mr. Andrew Lewis, here to inspect the property before formal possession was established. He had taken a room at the Pelican in the village for the duration of his stay, which he estimated at 4 or 5 days. He bowed correctly and spoke without surplus. He did not, Eleanor noticed, look at her in the practised way that Mr. Hartwell looked at her, the way of a man calculating. "Miss Voss," he said, "I understand you are familiar with the property." "I have lived here for 26 years, she said. "Then I should be grateful for whatever you are willing to show me." It was a correctly phrased request, and Eleanor had no particular reason to refuse it. She was, in the present circumstances of her life, being asked to extend every courtesy to the man who had purchased her home. She understood this. She did not find it pleasant, but she understood it, and she was not in the habit of allowing what was unpleasant to alter what was right. They began with the kitchen garden that same afternoon, because Eleanor was already there and it seemed the natural starting point. She showed him the herb beds and the espalier wall where the pears grew, and the old stone water cistern that her grandmother had built and that had never once failed in Eleanor's memory. He asked practical questions. How deep was the cistern, and had it held through the dry summer of the year before? Was the drainage in the lower garden adequate, or did it pool after heavy rain? Had the stable roof been recently repaired? She answered each question precisely, without embellishment, and he listened without interrupting. It was, she found, an unexpectedly comfortable mode of conversation with a person who was, by every legal and domestic measure, her adversary. He came back the following morning, and the morning after that. He came on foot from the village each time, which meant that he arrived already familiar with the lane and the way the light fell at that hour. On the second morning he arrived while Eleanor was in the stable helping the groom James settle one of the mares who had been restless in the night, and he rolled back his cuff and held the mare's head with complete calm, while Eleanor checked the foreleg, and said nothing about the fact that this was not precisely the sort of task one expected a household's eldest daughter to be performing unassisted. "She does not like the cold mornings," Eleanor said, running her fingers along the leg and finding nothing wrong, only winter reluctance. "Nor do most sensible creatures," he said. It was the first time she heard the dry, private humour that was, she would come to think, among his most distinctive qualities. It did not announce itself. It arrived in the space where another person might have offered a platitude, and it was always accurate. On the third morning he asked to see the library. Eleanor led him in through the hall and across the drawing-room, and opened the library door, and she saw him stop in the threshold, the way people stop when a room is larger or richer than its exterior suggested. The library at Ashford ran the full depth of the west wing, low-ceilinged and warm-windowed, its shelves fitted into the old plasterwork in a way that made the room feel as though it had grown the books rather than acquired them. The fire was laid, but not lit. The morning light came in at an angle across the reading table where Eleanor's natural history still lay, and the room smelled, as it always did in autumn, of old paper and dry wood and something faintly mineral that she had never been able to name. He walked along the near shelves without touching anything, reading the spines. "Your grandmother's," he said, at a particular section. "Her name is still in many of them," Eleanor said. "And these?" He had stopped at the section she privately thought of as her own, the natural histories and the botanical surveys and the 3 volumes of philosophical correspondence she had read so many times that their spines had softened. "Mine," she said. He turned and looked at her, not in the calculating way, and not in the polite social way, but in the particular way of a person registering information they had not expected to find, and choosing not to dissemble about it. "You read natural history," he said. "I read most things," she said. He did not say anything further for a moment. He looked back at the shelves, and Eleanor looked at the fire that had not been lit, and the room held them both in a quiet that was not uncomfortable and was not neutral. It was the particular quality of stillness that gathers in rooms where 2 people have, by chance or by careful inattention, let their guard down at the same moment. She was the first to move. She crossed to the window and opened the shutter to let in more light. And the moment passed, and they talked for another hour about the condition of the library's plasterwork and whether the north-facing shelf had suffered from damp. But she thought about the stillness afterward. She thought about it more than she wished to. Her mother had not been idle in the meantime. Margaret had taken Mr. Lewis's arrival as both an opportunity and a clarification. The opportunity being that a buyer's presence made the sales reality vivid enough to press her case for Mr. Hartwell, and the clarification being that the sale meant Eleanor had no further claim of domestic position on Ashford, and therefore no rational grounds for resistance. Mr. Hartwell had called twice in the week since his letter. He was a lean, watchful man of 40, with recently acquired property in the next county, and the conversational habit of returning every subject to questions of income and social standing, which Margaret considered evidence of prudent character, and which Eleanor found exhausting in the particular way of things that are relentlessly themselves. "He is not unkind," Margaret said to Eleanor on the 4th evening, sitting at the drawing-room fire after dinner while Gerald had retired. "He is not a romantic figure, I grant you that. But at your age, Eleanor, romantic figures are a luxury one cannot afford." Eleanor was working at the embroidery frame, though she had not advanced it in 20 minutes. "You have not asked me what I think of him." "I know what you think of him. I am telling you what I think, which is that you are 26 years old and this household will not sustain you indefinitely, and Mr. Hartwell has the means to provide very comfortably for a wife who does not make excessive demands." "I have made no demands of this household," Eleanor said, "excessive or otherwise." "That is precisely the difficulty," Margaret said, and turned back to her correspondence. It was the next afternoon that Eleanor heard her father. She had not meant to hear it. She had been on her way to the study with the household accounts ledger, which Gerald had asked for and which she had spent the morning reconciling, and she had come along the lower corridor and stopped because the study door was not quite latched and her father's voice was reaching her with an unguarded clarity that she had not expected. He was not talking to Mr. Crabbe. The voice that answered him was lower and unfamiliar, and it took Eleanor a moment to understand it belonged to a man she had not met, a second solicitor or perhaps an agent, someone connected to the purchase. She stood in the corridor because the first sentence she had caught had already made her unable to move. "It was not my intention to put her out," her father was saying. "You must understand that. I intended for her to be settled before the possession changed hands." "And Mr. Hartwell," the other voice said, He is willing. His terms are reasonable. A pause, and Eleanor heard her father shift in his chair, the particular creak of the old oak chair she had known since childhood. She does not know the full of it. She knows the house is sold. She does not know that the sale was the condition of my debt's discharge, and that I had no other means of it. If she were to know that her father sold the home of her grandmother to pay a card table, she would think less of me than she already does. The buyer is aware of the arrangement. He made no objection. Gerald's voice had the quality it always acquired when he was performing regret without experiencing it. Slightly elevated, slightly too careful. He said only that he expected the household to be treated fairly, whatever that is worth. Eleanor stood very still in the corridor with the ledger against her chest, and the November cold coming in under the passage door behind her. And she understood several things at once. She understood that the debt had not been a consequence of the house's sale, but the reason for it. She understood that her father had not sold Ashford because he had needed the money and the property was available, but because the debt had been called and the property was all he had that was worth £800. She understood that Mr. Hartwell's renewed interest was not coincidental to her father's circumstances, but connected to them, that the arrangement, whatever its precise terms, served Gerald's purpose as much as any ostensible concern for Eleanor's future. She turned and walked back along the corridor the way she had come. She did not go into the study. She did not go upstairs. She went to the kitchen garden because it was cold there, and the cold was honest, and she stood among the bare herb beds with her hand on the stone wall her grandmother had built, and she breathed until the tightness in her chest had resolved itself into something she could carry. She was not without resources, internal ones. She had known for some time that her father was not a man whose judgment could be trusted in the management of important things. She had known for nearly as long that her mother's definition of her future had never included Eleanor's own preferences as a significant variable. She had understood in the abstract that the household's financial instability was her instability by extension. But understanding a thing in the abstract and hearing it said aloud through an unlatched door in one's own house, with no buffer of ignorance remaining, were different experiences. The second one sat in the body differently. She was still standing at the wall when Mr. Lewis came along the gravel path from the direction of the stable, carrying, of all things, the small whetstone he had borrowed from James that morning to sharpen the old pruning knife he had found hanging in the potting shed. He stopped when he saw her. He did not ask what was wrong. He looked at her face and he looked at her hand on the stone wall, and he said nothing for a moment. And then he said, "The orchard needs cutting back before winter. Would you be willing to walk it with me?" It was an offer of occupation, which was the kindest thing anyone could have offered her at that moment, and it surprised her enough that she went. They walked the orchard in the late afternoon light for nearly an hour, and Eleanor pointed out the trees that had fruited well and the 3 that had not, and where the old apple with the split trunk had been propped with an iron bracket by her grandmother 30 years before, and was still, against all reasonable expectation, bearing fruit. He listened and he walked beside her, and he was neither intrusive nor distant. And by the time they reached the orchard's far edge where the wall met the beech trees, Eleanor found that the tightness she had carried from the corridor had eased to something she could examine steadily. "You love this place," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I understand that," he said. She did not know then what he meant by it. She took it as the sympathetic observation of a person capable of sympathy, nothing more, and was grateful for it in the measured way she permitted herself to be grateful for things she had not expected. He came again the following morning, and the morning after, and what had begun as a guided inspection of the property had become something else. some arrangement of days that had its own logic and rhythm, and that neither of them named. He found her in the library on the 6th morning before she had lit the lamps, and she was reading by the window in the grey light, and he came in and sat at the other side of the table and opened the estate ledger he had been reviewing, and they worked in the same room, in the same silence for 2 hours, without any occasion for awkwardness, and with a great deal of occasion for the particular calm that settles when two people have stopped needing to establish themselves to each other. He had brought, that morning, 2 books from the inn, a survey of Hertfordshire agriculture and, beneath it, a small volume she recognized as a collection of essays on natural history she had mentioned once in passing, which she had not read and which was not easy to come by in the county. He set it on the table near her hand without comment. She looked at it, and looked at him, and said, "You went to some trouble for this." "The Pelican's landlord has a brother who keeps a lending library in the village," he said without looking up from the ledger. "It took 10 minutes. "None the less," she said. "None the less," he agreed. Margaret announced at dinner that same evening that Mr. Hartwell would call on Saturday. She said it at the table in front of Eleanor and Gerald, with the tone of someone announcing a calendar event already settled, nothing to be discussed. Gerald nodded. Eleanor cut her bread into pieces she did not eat. Mrs. Beale, who was setting the second course, did not look up, which was itself a form of comment. Eleanor did not sleep well that night. She lay in her room and looked at the ceiling she had looked at for 26 years, and considered, with the patience she had trained herself to, the shape of what was being built around her. Hartwell, the sale, her father's debt discharged, and his obligation to her, such as it had ever been, resolved with it. Her mother's logic, which was impervious to argument, because it was not at its foundation about Eleanor at all, only about the social order as Margaret had mapped it, the order in which a daughter without property was a liability to be placed, and a daughter with a suitable husband was an obligation discharged. She got up before dawn and went to the library and lit the fire herself, and sat with it until the morning came in through the east window, grey and sharp and cold. Mr. Lewis arrived at 8. He found her where she was, and he must have seen something in her posture, or in the set of her shoulders at the reading table, because he did not offer the easy remark he usually had ready. He sat down and poured himself coffee from the pot Mrs. Beale had brought earlier and said, "When is Hartwell expected?" "Saturday," Eleanor said. He nodded. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Outside, the first proper frost of the season had come in the night, and the kitchen garden was white at the edges, the stone walls outlined in it. The beech trees in the north hedge had lost their last leaves and stood bare against the sky. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it did not feel like a liberty. She looked at him. "I would ask you to be patient," he said. "Only for a little longer. I know that is a considerable request in the present circumstances." "You know something," she said. "I know several things," he said. "I am not able to tell you all of them yet. I am asking for 2 more days." She regarded him for a long moment, this man she had walked the orchard with and sat beside in the library, and who had brought her a natural history essay collection on the strength of a passing remark, and who had held a restless mare's head in the stable at 7 in the morning, with no apparent concern for his coat. She considered all the available evidence, which her grandmother would have called reading a man's posture, more than his words. 2 days, she said. He nodded once, and did not elaborate, and they sat in the library for another hour with the fire and the frost outside and the books on all sides, and Eleanor thought it was possible that she would miss this room for the rest of her life. Mr. Hartwell called on Saturday as Margaret had promised, and the drawing-room was arranged for the occasion with a precision that Eleanor recognised as her mother's idea of ceremony. The good china was on the table. The fire had been built up to a hospitality that Ashford's fireplaces rarely received outside Christmas. Gerald was present, which meant he had been managed into attendance, and Margaret wore her best afternoon dress and the amber brooch she kept for calls of consequence. Hartwell came in with the air of a man who had already decided the outcome and was performing the remaining steps as a courtesy to everyone else's need for process. He was correct with Eleanor and expansive with her parents and made two distinct observations in the first quarter hour about the improvements he intended to make to Ashford once possession was settled, including a reference to the library that made Eleanor's hands tighten in her lap. A suggestion that the volumes might be cleared to make the room more suitable for receiving. "The library is well stocked," Eleanor said. "For a private house," Hartwell said pleasantly. "Though I find that in practice one requires perhaps a tenth of what is kept on the shelves of properties like this. The rest is sentiment." "A great deal of what is valuable is sentiment," Eleanor said. Margaret's look from across the room was a small compression of the lips that meant Eleanor had said the wrong thing. Gerald examined his sleeve. It was at that moment that the front door of Ashford opened, which it should not have done without Mrs. Beale or the parlour-maid conducting it, and a man Eleanor had not seen before came into the hall and knocked at the open drawing-room door with the brisk authority of someone who has been given to understand that doors are not his obstacle. He was young, well-dressed, and carrying a leather satchel and a letter, and he looked first at Eleanor, then at the assembled room, and then at the figure in the doorway behind him, who had apparently entered the house at his heels. Mr. Lewis stood at the drawing-room's threshold. He was not wearing the dark wool coat. He was wearing instead a coat of a different order altogether, navy superfine with a collar that announced itself without any surplus, and the bearing he carried into the room was precisely the same bearing he had carried through the kitchen garden and the orchard and the library, except that in this room, with this coat, and with the young man at his side who was now standing very straight and preparing to speak, that bearing resolved into something unmistakably specific. "Your Grace," the young man said, with the trained ease of someone who had said this phrase many thousands of times. "I have the papers from Mr. Croft's office, as you requested." The drawing-room did not make a sound. Margaret's expression passed through three distinct stages in the space of a breath: incomprehension, and then a dawning that looked almost like physical pain, and then a rigidity that was her best social armour, deployed in emergency. Gerald stood up from his chair and sat back down in it. Hartwell went very still in the manner of a man who has just been shown that the game board he believed he was winning was not the game board in play. Eleanor sat in her chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap, and felt a stillness come over her that was nothing like the absence of feeling. The young man, the secretary, whose name she would later learn was Mr. Parry, opened his satchel and produced a document folded under a seal that was red and heavy and unambiguous. "The deed transfer, Your Grace," he said, "executed through Mr. Croft's office on the 16th of October, as directed." Andrew Lewis, who was the Duke of Calder, and had been the Duke of Calder for the entirety of his visit to Ashford Cottage, and the entirety of his morning walks from the Pelican, and the entirety of the hours in the library and the orchard and the stable, looked at Eleanor. "I should explain," he said, and the room attended to him in the reflexive silence that rooms arrange around a duke, "that the property was purchased in settlement of Mr. Voss's debt, as all parties are aware. The purchase price was £800, which discharged the debt completely. The deed was transferred, upon execution, into the name of Miss Eleanor Voss." He said her name the same way he had said it in the library that morning 3 days past, without performance, as though it were simply the true name of the person he was speaking about. The property, Mr. Parry added, producing the deed itself, which bore Eleanor's name in Mr. Croft's careful clerk's hand across the top fold, is held in Miss Voss's name, free and unencumbered. Margaret Voss opened her mouth, then closed it. The amber brooch at her collar rose and fell once. Gerald had gone the colour of unbleached linen. Hartwell stood with his hat in his hands in a manner that no longer suggested a man who had come to make arrangements, and he appeared to understand, with the particular clarity that descends when social calculations are revised at speed, that there was no arrangement to make. The owner of Ashford Cottage was standing at the window with her hands folded, and she had been the owner of Ashford Cottage since the 16th of October, and she had shown him around her own library and told him that sentiment was valuable, and she had been entirely correct. "I do not understand," Margaret said finally. Her voice was careful, the way a person is careful when they suspect that louder will not help them. "The property was sold. Gerald, you told me the property was sold." "It was sold," Gerald said. He was looking at the carpet. "The terms were not as I understood them." "The terms," Andrew said, "were established between myself and Mr. Crabbe, who was acting on Mr. Voss's behalf. They were set in writing. I should not have expected Mr. Voss to have read the full document with care." The observation was mild. It landed exactly as precisely as he apparently intended everything to land. Hartwell set his hat on the table near the door, which was as clear a signal as a formal declaration. "I believe," he said to no one in particular, "that I have taken enough of the household's time this afternoon." He made his bow to the room with the practised efficiency of a man who has had occasion to perform graceful retreats before. And Mrs. Beale, who had appeared in the drawing-room doorway at some point in the preceding 5 minutes, without Eleanor having registered her arrival, stepped back to allow him through the hall and to the front door, which she closed behind him with a quiet precision that expressed, in the way a door can express things, exactly what she thought of him. The drawing-room was left with Gerald in his chair and Margaret in hers, and Andrew Lewis standing at the table where Mr. Parry had laid the deed, and Eleanor at the window where the frost-killed kitchen garden was visible in the late afternoon light, white and still and stubborn. Margaret looked at her daughter. It was a long look, the kind that contains several speeches that have all been abandoned before they began, because none of them would work. Eleanor met it without returning any particular expression. She had nothing to perform for her mother, and she had never pretended otherwise. "I take it," Margaret said at last with a dignified flatness that was the closest she was capable of getting to concession, "that you are not ignorant of this." "I was entirely ignorant of this," Eleanor said, "until this moment." This produced in her mother's expression a second wave of adjustment, and Eleanor understood that she would be required at some later and calmer hour to believe this. There was nothing more to be done about Margaret at present. Gerald, who had not moved from his chair, said, "I am sorry, Eleanor," in a voice stripped of the slight elevation it usually carried. It was the most honest sentence she had heard him speak in several years. She looked at him and found that she could receive it without requiring it to be more than it was. "Your debt is discharged," she said. "That was what you needed." It was not absolution, and she did not mean it as absolution. She meant it as a fact stated plainly, which was all the territory she was able to offer him. Andrew waited until her parents had withdrawn, Margaret with her back straight, and Gerald with the slightly deflated posture of a man whose debts have been settled, and whose dignity has not. And then he and Eleanor were alone in the drawing-room with the deed on the table and the fire burning, and the early dark coming in at the windows. Mr. Parry had gone into the hall. Eleanor could hear him speaking quietly to Mrs. Beale, the housekeeper's voice low and unhurried, and then the sound of her quiet laugh, which was rare enough that Eleanor registered it as significant. "You arranged this before you came," Eleanor said. "I arranged the deed transfer before I came," Andrew said. "The rest I arranged after." "The rest," she said. "The 2 days I asked for. I wanted to know, before the revelation was made, whether you would stay." He paused. He was standing at the table with one hand on the edge of it, not far from her. "I will not pretend the arrangement was altruistic from its inception. I had heard of Ashford from a neighbour who knew your grandmother's estate, and I knew something of its condition. But the arrangement as I intend it has nothing to do with altruism, and everything to do with what I have learned in 10 days of walking this property with its proper owner." Eleanor looked at the deed with her name on it. She looked at him. "You told me to be patient," she said. "I did." "I find I am willing to have been patient," she said. He crossed the room to where she stood by the window, and the kitchen garden was behind her in the dark and the frost white, and the library was next door with its 400 volumes, and the fire she had lit herself that morning, and the stone wall her grandmother had built was out there somewhere in the cold, still standing, as it had stood for 30 years, against every reasonable expectation. He said, "I should like to know, if you are willing to tell me, whether a man who arrived at this house 10 days ago under less than complete disclosure might have any prospect of returning to it under better terms." Eleanor regarded him with the patience she had refined across 26 years of a life that had required it of her in every season. "You held a mare's head in the cold," she said, without being asked. "You asked to see the library and you read the spines without touching anything. You brought me a natural history collection on the basis of a remark I made in passing, and you walked the orchard with me on an afternoon when I needed something honest to do with my hands." She paused. "I think your prospects are not poor." The warmth that came into his expression at that was a quieter thing than she might have expected from a man receiving the answer he wanted, and more genuine for being quiet. "Then I should like," he said, "to call on you properly, if you will allow it." "You may call on me," Eleanor said, "whenever you wish. You will find me in my own house." The fire had burned down to a steady warmth by the time Mr. Parry and Mrs. Beale came back along the hall, and Eleanor carried the deed to the writing table, where the household accounts ledger had always sat, and set it down beside the lamp, and the paper held her name in the lamplight, in the careful, unhurried hand of someone who had written it, meaning for it to stay. She heard Andrew's chaise on the gravel drive a little later, departing for the Pelican, with the comfortable certainty of a man who knew he would return in the morning, and the sound of the wheels faded into the October night and left the house to its proper quiet. Mrs. Beale came in without knocking, which was their long-standing custom, and set a second cup on the writing table and poured from the pot she had brought. "He is, as it turns out," Mrs. Beale said, settling herself in the chair near the fire with the serene composure of a woman who has been waiting 22 years for a turn of this particular kind. "A man of very sound sense." "He is," Eleanor agreed. "Your grandmother would have approved of the deed arrangement," Mrs. Beale said. "She was very particular about property." "She was," Eleanor said. The lamplight lay across the desk, and across the deed, and across the 4 walls of Ashford Cottage, which had been her grandmother's, and was now hers. And the stone wall in the kitchen garden stood in the dark outside as it had always stood, patient as anything worth keeping. Eleanor picked up the teacup and held it in both hands, and let the warmth of it settle all the way through. She was home.